Sometimes this early in the morning it's very hard to communicate. But I want to point out idols for a moment. Idols. God has invited us into a relationship with Him. Is ministry more important? It's an idol. Is preaching more important? It's an idol. Is morality more important? It's an idol. I was in a philosophy class years ago, and we were talking about altruism. And the professor argued that there's no such thing as altruism. That is, to do something solely for someone else. And this one student who was really clever, he raised his hand and he said, I am altruistic. And the professor said, what's your defense of that? He goes, I do everything for my mother. And it was an ongoing thing. I mean, throughout the entire semester, every time the student was asked something, the student would say, I do that for my mother. And the professor and he would just go back and forth kind of in a friendly banter all semester. There is a sense in which, no, not just a sense. Everything we do for Him. If it's done for any other reason, it's not right. You do not love your wife ultimately. You should not love your wife ultimately for your wife's sake. You should love your wife for Him. You should go to the mission field, not ultimately for the sake of those who are perishing without the gospel. Even though that should be a motive. You should go for Him. If you go for Him, you can't fail. Do you realize that? If you go for any other reason, there's a possibility of failure. You go for Him, you can't fail. Because no matter what happens, I'm here for Him. I'm here for Him. I love her for Him. Therefore, no matter how she responds, doesn't matter. Your marriage is strong. Why? You're in it for Him. You do it for Him. And see, that's what it means when we talk about being holy. Do you see, men, now I don't want you to use this in a wrong way, but do you see how outwardly correct we can be and how inwardly wrong we can be? Okay, great, you don't commit adultery. That's good. You're not building large Easter Island-looking idols out of stone in your front yard. That's good. You're not robbing people, beating up elderly ladies and taking away their Social Security check. Wonderful. But do you see how dark you can be by even doing right things but not for Him? Remember what it says. Romans 1, what is the chief sin there? It's not homosexuality. The chief sin, the greatest, most abominable thing mentioned in that list is although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor give thanks. Now let's go over to Paul's admonition. Whether you eat or drink, even the most menial task, why do you do it? For the glory of God. If you don't do it for the glory of God, then why do you do it? So there's a lot to be said about this. Now let's go on. According to verse 7, we need to ask ourselves, was God's election and calling of Israel based upon some greatness or merit in them? Or was it something found in God? In verse 7 he says, the Lord did not set His love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. I've written here, God's choice and redemption of Israel was not because of any merit found in them. On the contrary, they were the smallest and weakest among the nations. The reason or cause for salvation is never found in man, but in God's purpose and good pleasure. One glimpse of man's depravity and rebellion is testimony enough to prove that such things are so. According to 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 28, the same may be said of the New Testament church. Remember what he says there? Not many of you noble, not many wise. Boy, I could add to that list this morning. Not many of you very good looking. Not many snappy dressers among you. I mean, if you look, that is the way God has always moved. Always. He always goes in that direction. He chooses the things that are not to confound the wisdom and strength and supposed righteousness of this world. Always. He sets the standard here at the very beginning. I always tell people, salvation is the only thing I ever qualified for. You are so wrong when you think that you've got to reach a certain level, go up a certain level to be used. To be used of God, you just need to become more and more aware of self, of what you are, and your great need of Him. Just dependence. That's why God works through weak men. And God will orchestrate no matter what in their lives to continue weakening them. And if He gives them greater revelation, He will give them greater pain. He will give them things in their life so that they're not exalted. He'll do whatever He has to do. Because being used of God is not reaching some super spiritual level. Being used of God comes through God's providence working in our life, demonstrating our weakness to a greater and greater degree and His sufficiency to a greater and greater degree. So in the end, we're used more than ever, and yet recognize that we've offered less than ever. That it's all of grace and it's all of Him. Most of all of God's providence in the believer's life is to demonstrate to them the reality of their weakness, that they might be filled with the fullness of God. Now, one of my favorite parts here is verse 8. It is my favorite part. But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which He swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And what is he saying? Why did the Lord love you? Well, here's the answer. Because He loved you. Now let's read some notes here that I've written down. He says, because the Lord loved you. The first reason given for God's election and calling of Israel is more a taunt than an explanation. I did it because I did it. That's what he's saying. I loved you because I loved you. I did it because I did it. It is a powerful way to explain that there is no reason for God's love toward man outside of God Himself. Why did you love me? I loved you because I loved you. What